it was a hard notion to step away from. My question is, what was our life like since the abolition of slavery? Did our lives improve? Did life improve, for African Americans? Now, I would just ask that you guys keep it short because we are running our personal time. And anyone could take a shot at that question.
I'll answer it. And it's complicated, but yes, life improved, right? Legally, you weren't property. And so in the state of Mississippi, for instance, that had the largest black population in 1865, what happens is you have a literally unskilled, and by that I mean most of the people doing work were working on farms, so they were picking cotton. You have an unskilled labor force, you have an illiterate black labor force, and within 12 years you have black schools, a literacy rate over 75%, black banks, black people who own land. So yes, in a very real sense, the material lives of black people improved. Black families are reunited. Black men and women are getting married. There's the establishment of the Southern Black Church. So all of these great things are happening. But what complicates that is 1 month before the 13th Amendment is passed, Mississippi passes the Black Codes. So much of the crime, the criminalization of black people and poor people happens in November 1865. So they take slave codes and essentially turn them into black codes, and black people are having to battle this. So one of the facets of kind of the criminalization of black people and poor people is if you are considered a vagrant, that means someone who doesn't have a job, you are hanging out, and this is actual language, in the morning or night. So I'm like, well, what? I mean, what does that leave you, right? The morning and night, right? And you are unemployed, you are considered a vagrant. And a vagrant then becomes the property of the state because he or she is now a part of the convict leasing system that Shoshana talked about. So, you know, that I think specifically nuances the question that Shay poses with regard to the kind of challenges that black people are facing right after slavery.
Say this, I'm glad it's over. I wouldn't want that to keep going.
Well, I think it depends on the era or the perspective of what you're gonna look at it. Of course, like right now, yes, life is better. We have a black president. Like let's start with that. Like and that's a major accomplishment in itself. You know, to go from slavery to be bonded and chained and shackled to having a black president, you know, be the leader of the free world. And then also, in terms of economically, we did well. Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street, 1921. Greenwood, Tulsa, Greenwood, Oklahoma. Like, there were, like she said, black colleges, black banks, black theaters. So we were making money. We said, okay, listen, you know, we came from nothing, now we're going to make something of ourselves. So even though in terms of, yeah, of course you're going to have problems still, they still were lynching us, they still were coming after us, they burned down Tulsa, Oklahoma, but still for a period in time, we did thrive. So it did get better for us at some point. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than, you know, staying in an outhouse, eating scraps and stuff, to now you'll be able to provide for yourself and for your family. So it depends on like your point of reference or what point in time that you're looking at it. But of course it's not perfect, but it did get better.
If I could, a little bit. I would also say that, like you were saying, the Black Wall Street is phenomenal. There's a lot of black success, but success also becomes a double-edged sword. So the people that are being lynched aren't worthless Negroes, right? They're landowners, they're teachers, they're the people that have something to offer. So that if you lynch the person who owns 50 or 60 or 100 acres, then where does his land go to, right? It's up for grabs. So one of the greatest targets were property owners of lynching. Some of the greatest targets were servicemen, right? Coming back from the war to see a black man in a uniform, maybe not armed, but with the potential to be armed when he's in war, was one of the greatest threats ever. So we see all of these great pinnacles of success, and yet that's the same thing that makes you a target of the mob.
Now, One historic challenge for the United States was the Reconstruction of 1865 to 1867. Cruel and unfair laws were adopted by southern states after the Civil War in an attempt to reestablish the old social structure. How did the Reconstruction era further lead toward racial divide for African Americans? What were the downfalls of our freedom?
I mean, I'm actually going to push back on that question only because I just gave a lecture on Reconstruction. and in it, we talked about the benefits of Reconstruction, that Reconstruction did a lot of great things. The problem was it was just short-lived, right? It only lasted about 12 years. In Reconstruction, black men get the vote. You get the creation of public schools. Reconstruction is not just a benefit for newly freed slaves, but for also poor white people living in the South who've never had the ability to access public education. Your first hospitals are created during Reconstruction. Your first roads, your first health organizations, hospitals for the insane, the elderly and the infirm. All of that is created during Reconstruction. The ability to be able to own land. There are some people who did get 40 acres and a mule. It gets taken away, but there are some people who got it. So Reconstruction actually is quite remarkable in the fact that it only happens in the United States. Slaves in Jamaica got nothing. Slaves in Haiti got nothing. Slaves who were living anywhere else in the Atlantic world, there is no such thing like Reconstruction that exists on the political or economic landscape. So it's actually quite remarkable. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't last long at all, and that's where the biggest disadvantage is. And so when you have the Great Compromise, when the South basically says we want Northern troops out of our state, we want control over our land again, we want control over the politics. We're going to create rules that basically say you can't vote unless your grandfather voted. Yeah. So for all black men who just voted, they can't vote anymore, right? So a lot changes after 1877 to make Reconstruction no longer useful. But it's astonishing the amount of progress that happened in a very short amount of time after slavery.
I want to also say, like, I think that I agree, and I think we also often need to be conscious of sort of stepping back and being like, oh, well, it's better now, right? And really thoughtful about that, because at the same time that those great things were happening, there were a lot of terrible things happening at the same time, right? And so that's what makes it, so that's where we get stuck in the mud around, well, but it's better, but you know, we're not in the outhouse anymore. And it's like, yes, and there are still all these horrific things happening, right? Like, yes, we have a black president, and we have Akai Gurley, right? And we have Eric Gardner, and we have Michael Brown, right? Like, there are all these great things happening, but like not so much, right? They're happening for a very small percentage of black folk. They're not happening for black folk en masse. And I think that's where we need to be really conscious, because we get comfortable in that. And the system plays off of that. The system says, well, boy, you got a black president, now chill out, yo. Right? And not recognizing that a lot of the gains that we get, like you said, I'm glad that you brought that up, but a lot of the gains that we get end up really, really helping out poor white folk, and black folk get the brunt of the backlash around it. So if you look at welfare, the majority of people who are on welfare, public assistance, cash assistance, benefits, are poor white folk. But when we think about the stereotype of welfare, what the media puts out there, etc., right, what our politicians and sort of like all of that conversation looks like when we talk about it, you know, I'm thinking about my Sunday morning news, right? I'm thinking about Meet the Press and all of that. What that looks like is like, oh, the black folks in the poor neighborhoods in the hood, right? But that's not what it is. So I think we really need to be careful when we get into this, like, was it better? Yes, it's better, and it was, right? Like, there's pieces here and there that we can point at, but that's not, I don't think, across the board.
Now, in 1963, John F. Kennedy said, about 1/2 as much chance of completing high school as a white baby born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much chance of completing college. 1/3 as much chance of becoming a professional man. Twice as much chance of becoming unemployed. About 1/7 as much chance of earning $10,000 a year, a life expectancy, which is 7 years shorter than the prospects of earning only half as much. 50 years after the Civil Rights Act, do you think the Civil Rights Movement changed race relations in the United States? Do you feel that progress has been made?
It changed the law.
Pretty much.
But, and I think, you know, there are not many people who are going to, if they're honest about racial relations in this country, it changed the law. And so racism takes on a different form. But racism still exists. And so I think that's the real kind of crux of that question. And the other thing is too, you know, we're talking about a group of people of African descent in this country who, you know, in many ways, those numbers have lessened in certain ways, right? And so in terms of the most educated Americans disproportionately are black women, right? Black rates of longevity, right? Lifespans have increased. They're still under that of white Americans, but they've increased. So there are certain things that we can point to as evidence, right, of our lives getting better in terms of the physicality. There are more black homeowners. There's still a mass movement of people who are searching for at least an easier existence. So during Reconstruction, they were moving up north. Now they returned back to the south, right? So it's literally a reverse pattern. But I think what's really important and what has really brought us here tonight is to kind of center some of those stats and look at it from the perspective of that involuntary servitude piece, right? That what we've been mentioning. And I do have a few numbers. There's a book called Black Stats. I was just on the phone with the civil rights pioneer, Ruby Sales, who does a lot of work around mass incarceration and reform. And we were talking about this book. And as I was reading, because I don't do 20th century and 21st century, I'm a 19th century person, but this literally struck me. There is a stat that we hear repeated a lot. And it's a false stat, right? If we think about the raw numbers. That is, there are more black men in prison than college. Not true. But let me tell you why this stat is still important and why it should still bother us. Because when you think about the age of college, you're talking about people from 18, and I'm going to be generous here, to about 24. When you're talking about black men in college, in prison, that ranges from teenagers who are in adult prisons all the way up to that aged population that the sister mentioned in her presentation. Now, I'm going to sit that here. When we think about the black people who were brought to colonial America, before it was even the United States, there was a little less than 500,000. Then that was in 1619. By the 1830s, there were 1 million black people who moved from the upper South to the lower South in what was considered the second Middle Passage. But this time it wasn't on a boat. It was literally sending people from up South to down South. Now, when we look at the numbers, the actual statistics of black men and women incarcerated, it equals more than black people who were brought to what becomes the United States. And black people, that million who were literally transported from the up South to the down South. So now you have numbers where, and this is 2011, that's why I'm saying this book is really important. You can get it at any bookstore. 36% of all male prisoners are black. 25% of women prisoners are black. So that's a quarter for black women and 36%. So when we round up, almost 40%. Black people only make up 14% of the population, and that's including the ones who check other. So when you think about those kinds of stats, right, we can say, oh, that's not true. But let's think about it per ratio. Let's think about it proportionally. And those are alarming figures.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, at this time, I would like to open up the floor to the public, and you are welcome to ask our panelists any question that is on your mind.
I have a question that's on my mind. Oftentimes when people have discussions, they talk about why whites do better in this, do better in that, why they do better in school, why they do better in math or reading, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And usually the excuse is always given, well, we were enslaved for so many years. They weren't enslaved, and this is the reason why. How truthful is that statement? Yeah, I don't care.
So I think that when I think, and I work in a school, so this hits home for me. When I think about sort of where we are educationally, and I work with some folks who are doing homeschool organizing in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, black and brown folks who are organizing cooperative homeschooling opportunities. You know, there's two parts to this. There's one part that is the truth. There's one part that is a truth, a biological fact, that trauma travels through our DNA. So on a physiological level, yes, we as people feel the impact of slavery. So when you experience a traumatic event, and I speak from, right now, I'm speaking from my social worker hat right now, and studying trauma. Trauma impacts your brain development. So at whatever age you're experiencing trauma, the development of your brain has a shift. There's something that happens physiologically, been studied inside your brain, that marks that moment for you. That then becomes a part of your DNA, a part of the way that you interpret the world, a part of the way that you react, a part of the way that you have interactions with other people, how you then teach your children to have interactions. And so there's a physiological piece that is true, right? And there's been books on that. But then there's another piece of the social piece, right? So when I teach my, I don't have children, but if I were to have children, and I'm sure the parents in the audience would agree, that you teach your children what you know. You teach your children how to respond to people the way you respond to people. So when you say good morning, you're going to make sure that your child also says good morning, right? And if they don't, you're going to say, hey, say good morning, right? So you teach your children how to socialize the way you've been socialized. And so that also comes out if we have trauma, if we have a defense socially, and we haven't worked on that and we haven't healed from that in a real way, a direct manner, that comes out in how we teach our children. So there's two prongs of that. Then the third piece, on a systemic level, that's an individual level. On a systemic level, right? Or rather, I'll go to the community level, the meso level, as a community. So we could consider us a community. You could consider your church a community. You could consider your block a community, right? On a community level, we haven't healed. We are not really talking about what we need to do as people of color who have had family who's experienced slavery. We have descendants of slaves. We have not talked about how we are healing. How are those things impacting our lives, and what does that look like? We don't really take healing seriously on a massive level. There are pockets here and there, but on a massive level, we are not in conversation about that. Oftentimes for our youth over here, it feels like slavery was so long ago, but that was my great-grandmother. It was not that long ago. It's not that far ago. But we make it seem like, oh, that's history. Like, that's just in the past. We here now, right? So there's that piece of it. And on a systemic level, and I'll wrap up with this. On a systemic level, the education system that we have, our public schools, are not designed by us or for us.
Yes.
They are not. The Common Core is not designed by or for people of color, and there are distinct differences in the ways different communities learn. If you go back in history, and I'm sure my historians can share a little bit more, and you look at in Europe, you look at Africa, and you look at the tribes and the more indigenous folks and how they learned, how their communities were set up, you'll see that it wasn't set up the way we teach now. This is a very Eurocentric way of teaching that doesn't speak to our children's hearts.
Now,
And with that.
my gentleman over here has a question.
Yeah, you know, sister, I couldn't agree with you more. First, I want to thank the senator for bringing this program.
But he's not here.
But I still want to thank him, brother. I want to thank each and every one of you. I had some place to go today, but once I heard about this, I decided to come here, and I can say it's definitely worth it. Sister, you're right about the school system. You know, we're the only people that send our children into a system that benefit by miseducating them and don't get involved. I spent 25 years volunteering in the school system because black men do not volunteer. Brother, as far as your first and your second question, your first and your third, I saw the input of Marcus Garvey here in 1914. Of course, we're happy to be out of slavery. However, Marcus Garvey came with Black Wall Street and everything. We see an up movement of black people. But through integration, everything was lost. Everything was lost. We're talking about lynching. It's no different today. Our boys are being lynched and we're watching them. We're the only people that can defend our children. So is it really better for us? Are we still being lynched? Brother, you spoke about the great empire of Haiti. I can't say much more. So much has been done, but this country here has reversed all of that. My thing, and what's to you, what can we do as a people to make a difference going forward? Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was having a discussion with a couple of my colleagues and some friends of mine, and I think being 39 and knowing and having your grandparents go through that situation, one of the things that strikes me, and it's kind of alarming, is that if you think about our representation in terms of civil rights, Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson. I'm just saying, you know, look, I mean, look, and that's my point, and that's my point, and that's why I bring it up, because I think what happens is that there's a new way of thinking, and some of the methods that were used in the 60s, even though we can take some of those things and apply that now, I think the voice has to be different, and I think for right now, the problem that we have in uniting is that there is no young black voice to say, no, this is right. Because if you think about it, we're still going off of the words of Martin Luther King. We're still going off of the words of Malcolm X. But who's our voice? Who's the 20-something or the 30-something leader that can galvanize the youth? Because that's the population that's going to make the movement happen. It's not going to be us. You know, even though we are older, yes, we are, but it's the youth that's going to take that movement to the next level. So that's what I think might be one of the problems, in my opinion.
I'm going to just say, I'm sorry.
Just one last question, because we do have to close.
Can I just address just very quickly? The youth are speaking. And the thing is, they've chosen a different model. So Ella Baker, who was in King's time,